Welcome back to the Physics of Faith podcast. I'm Tim.
I'm Tommy.
And we are still in the Gospel of Mark. And I don't mean that as in like we continue to labor through it. We enjoy this. This is great to go through the gospel and talk about the life and times of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to go through, we'd gone through some of Paul's letters. We went through, was it James? Then we went through Peter, I guess both Peters. And we want to go through a gospel. Well, this is the shortest one. So this is kind of part of the reason why we're going this. Because we could have gone through Matthew and been in it for an entire year, because that's 8 chapters.
Right. So well, just wait till we get to like Isaiah.
Yeah.
No promises that we're going to break down Isaiah. But this has been a good exercise, and we're still enjoying it. We hope you're enjoying it as well. Let us know in the comments or in the reviews if you are getting anything out of this, or if you have any questions, so that we can maybe jump into that. But here we are, chapter 5. So why don't we just get started?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right. So we're going to start with verses 1 through 20. They came to the other side of the sea, into the region of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him anymore, not even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and the mountains and cutting himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him. And shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do you have with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, do not torment me." For he had already been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the region. Now there was a large herd of pigs feeding nearby on the mountain, and the demons begged him, saying, "Send us into the pigs so that we may enter them." Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. Their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and in the countryside, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. And then they came to Jesus and saw the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had previously had the legion, and they became frightened. Those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man, and all about the pigs. And they began to beg him to leave their region. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was begging him that he might accompany him. And he did not let him, but he said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. All right. So this is an interesting story, and as we're going through that, we see some really interesting things that are a little bit different than some of the things Jesus had previously done.
Yeah,
and there's something interesting about this story. But it starts with this demon-possessed man running to Jesus and imploring him, "Don't torment me."
Yeah,
and it even says that Jesus was already as he was running, Jesus was already commanding this demon to come out, right? The demons are recognizing Jesus as the Son of God, which is pretty consistent. And I think we talked about this before. One of the things that some scholars believe is there's kind of this tradition amongst the people of that time that by naming something, by having its true name, it gave you authority over it. So if people heard somebody speaking a true name, they thought that they had authority over it.
Yeah.
So this was a way that demons maybe tried to deceive people around them, that they need that, hey, we know who this is, right? Which perhaps lent itself to the Sanhedrin coming down and saying this man has an unclean spirit, right?
Yeah.
There's quite a lot here in this story as well that we don't see with the other demon possessed. There's a whole backstory.
Yeah.
We find out everything about this guy, how there's this reputation. They tried to chain him because he's unruly, and he hurts himself, and he's always screaming, and he's ridiculously strong. Like,
Yeah.
and he's breaking these chains. So we're seeing a lot about kind of how this man has been affected. And so we see, here's this guy, he's got these demons, he's got a reputation, and now Jesus is on the scene. And Jesus asks the demon to identify itself, and it doesn't really identify, because it says we are legion, which isn't its name.
Mm-hmm.
It's to indicate that there are multiple demons.
Yeah.
So
A legion of demons.
A legion of demons, right? And what's interesting about that is if you go back to this tradition of like knowing something's name in order to have authority over it,
Yeah.
Jesus doesn't get them to proclaim their name,
Yeah.
but he still exercises authority over these demons.
Yeah.
Showing anybody that's there that I don't need to know their names. I have authority over all things regardless
Yeah.
of who they say they are.
Yeah, you think about how much power these demons had over this man. I mean, obviously, this guy's not going to cut himself with rocks for on purpose,
Right?
You know,
yeah.
he's not like, hey, this is what I do. This is fun, you know.
Right.
And I'm sure that they're the ones that gave him the strength to break those chains. But my favorite part of this, and I didn't catch this, and I just underlined it now. This is why you read the Bible multiple
More than
times.
once, yeah.
I love it how it says, "Send us among the pigs." They say, "Allow us to go into them." He gave them permission.
Mm-hmm.
Like they are demons, and they had all this control over this man, but Jesus has to give them permission to do something. You know?
Yeah, I think that's opens a can of theological worms. You know, like how much permission is being given. I think there's something to be said there about, you know, is Jesus giving them permission because they need his permission to do things, or is he giving them permission because it's the alternative to what he was doing?
Yeah.
You know, so he hears what they have to say and he allows them to do this. As I was reading that, it occurred to me maybe why he allowed them to do this, because it does seem like a strange thing.
Yeah.
Right? So why does he allow them to do this? Well, what happens?
Mm-hmm.
The pigs run into the sea and drown, and the herdsmen run into town.
Yeah.
And in town is where they all know about the demon-possessed man.
Yeah.
And then they all come to see what happened. If this doesn't happen, who goes and draws the crowd?
Yeah.
Right? So I think there's a lot that you can kind of divine from that or understand from that.
Mm-hmm.
But like to your point, like this is God's world. We're all just living in it.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
You know? Yeah. So something else that was interesting here, I read in a commentary. This is a quote from Charles Spurgeon. Satan would rather vex swine than do no mischief at all. He is so fond of evil that he would work it upon animals if he cannot work it upon men. And I think this is something that we have to take seriously, is that it's all about chaos for them, right? For the principalities of evil and darkness, it's all about chaos and causing confusion and doing harm.
Yeah.
And they'll do it any which way they can.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so don't trust those things. Don't think that they're harmless. They're never working on your behalf.
Yeah.
This is one of those things I think Hollywood always gets wrong about when it tries to portray demons and things. But
well, and I mean this you can go into a whole other thing, and I think you and Brandon did a podcast on spiritual warfare. I think that was one of your first ones, wasn't it?
No,
maybe not. Well, so maybe there's an idea, but
we've discussed it a little bit. But
and I think it's that's one of those things that people don't talk about a lot, but it is important to know that like spiritual warfare exists.
Yeah.
There are demons and there are angels, and there is a whole battle going on that we can't see.
Yeah.
But it's also important to know that God is more powerful than the devil. God is more powerful than demons. And that there are while there are legions of demons, there are also legions of angels as well.
Yeah.
That fight those battles, and it's not something that we necessarily need to be worried about, because if Christ lives in your heart, demons cannot.
Right.
And and so, but it is something to be aware of and recognize that. Yeah, I think this is what's going on here.
Absolutely. I think we look at this and see how oppressed this man was, and by how much he was oppressed.
Yeah.
Jesus is still has the authority and the power to deliver you from that oppression, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter how deep you think you are into something.
Yeah.
God can always pull you out of it.
Yep.
All right. So then after the pigs drown, people come and see that the man's better. Mm-hmm. And something I find really interesting is they're afraid.
Yeah.
They're now scared. Like, here's this guy that they couldn't deal with, and how somebody has come and like completely changed his demeanor.
Yeah.
And it frightens them, and they begin to ask Jesus, can you leave? Like, we can't handle this. We don't understand this. Please go.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Not only what he did for the man, but here he says, in verse 16, what those had seen told people what had happened with the demon-possessed man, and told about the pigs as well. So they see that this man that is incredibly wild and crazy and completely possessed, Jesus heals him and drives I guess not necessarily heals him, but drives the spirit out.
Yeah.
And they ask to go into pigs, and he gives it permission to go into pigs, and pigs run down a hill into a lake and drown.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd tell somebody that too, because that's pretty wild.
Yeah.
I
can't deal with this.
So yeah, that's like what because it's also important. Like, Jesus didn't kill the pigs. Jesus didn't send the pigs down to drown.
Yeah.
He said, okay, fine, you can go into the pigs.
Yeah.
Better in the pigs than in this man.
Right.
And they are the ones that rush down the lake. But yeah, there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
It's one thing to see somebody that is sick or that is blind, and then Jesus heals them, and they're like, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. That's so wonderful. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you would be scared of that, but yeah, I can see how this can be kind of a scary thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Something interesting we see here too is I feel like this is, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first time we see in the book of Mark where Jesus does something for someone, and typically their response is to go off and tell everyone about it.
Yeah.
And Jesus is always like, don't do that.
Yeah.
But his response, this man's response is, take me with you.
Yeah.
I want to go with you, and I want to be where you are.
Yeah.
After this great thing that you've done. And Jesus' response is, no, go back into this region that's kicking me out.
Yeah.
And tell them about what I did for you.
Yeah.
This is like, he's flipped the script in this moment.
Yeah.
Right? He's, instead of telling the man to not go off and declare what happened, he's telling him to do the opposite, go and declare. Mm-hmm. And I think the reasoning behind this, and this is just me kind of reading into it, I feel like the reason for this is, number one, he sees the man's intention, right?
Yeah.
The guy is changed, and he is dedicated to Christ.
Yeah.
He's not just wowed by what has happened, right? Mm-hmm. So he tells him, go and tell everyone what I did for you in this region that Jesus was just asked to leave.
Yeah.
Right? So he's now preparing the hearts to receive the message of Christ by using the reputation of everybody had of him and showing them how he's been delivered.
Yeah.
And the man who did it, that had frightened everyone by doing it, isn't there to keep them in fear, right? So Jesus leaves, and he says, no, go tell them what I did for you. And this is how he's preparing their hearts to receive the gospel.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to look at that. I think, from a practical, and I think we talked about this earlier, from a practical and logistical standpoint, one of the reasons and Mark talks about this, that he didn't want people to tell is because he says, don't share this yet. Mm-hmm. And they did, and everybody came and crowded around him, and he couldn't get anywhere, Yeah. And so that caused issues, that he couldn't move about freely,
Right.
But in this situation, they've told him to leave, so he's getting ready to leave. So it's like, well, yeah, we're going to be gone. So yeah, go ahead and tell him. But I think you hit on something that is very interesting. That is different about this one in that Jesus knows the heart, and Jesus knows where. When people later on when the Pharisees would say something or when people would ask him a question, he knew why they were asking it, and he knew in their heart, they're trying to test him or they're trying to catch him in a lie, or he knows where that's coming from. And so when you think about, he heals a blind woman or he heals someone like that, he says, don't go off and tell, because he probably knows where that's going to come from and what their message is going to be.
Oh yeah.
But in this sense, this is a guy that you're right. He wanted to come with Jesus. He's like, all right, I get it. I want to do your work. I want to come with you. And Jesus sees that and he says, basically, you're better off sharing my gospel with these people.
Yeah.
Because I did for you something that they don't understand and that they were scared of. They're asking me to leave because of what I did for you.
Right.
Go tell them that what I did was a good thing.
Yes. Exactly. You were talking a little bit there about how we talked about this previously about the logistics of it all too.
Yeah.
And I heard something, and this goes back to chapter 1 or chapter 2 when Jesus healed the leper, and we talked about it, but I heard it talked about in a different context. I wanted to bring it up real quick.
Yeah.
This was an interesting that I hadn't thought of when we were talking about it. Mm-hmm. When Jesus heals the leper, he tells him to be quiet about it and just go do the thing that he's supposed to do, go present himself as clean at the temple.
Yeah.
But he doesn't, and Jesus' immediate response is to go out into the wilderness. And we kind of assumed it's because people are now going to be flocking to him. There's actually a law that because he had come in contact with a leper, he was supposed, in their laws and customs, you were supposed to now kind of quarantine for a specific set amount of time, and people would not allow you to come into the city.
Yeah.
So somebody had suggested that this is actually why Jesus was telling him to keep it on the DL.
Yeah.
Was because now he couldn't he couldn't freely move where he wanted to move. Maybe not because people were crowding him, because now they would be like, "Oh, you touched the leper, you need to go out into the wilderness."
For sure, yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's hard for us to understand how you be around somebody that's sick and you're supposed to quarantine. You're supposed to say, that's we don't have to do that now. We've never really experienced.
No, that's an old school thing. That's never
hint the sarcasm.
It's important to point out too that Jesus is the healing. So for him, it's probably even more so guys, I'm not going to get sick.
Yeah.
I'm okay. All right. So now we're going to read the rest of this chapter. So this is a lot, 21 through 43. And we see what happens when Jesus goes back across the lake to the sea to the other side. All right. So verse 21. When Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed by the seashore. And one of the synagogue officials named Jairus came and upon seeing him fell at his feet and pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live." And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him. A woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but instead had become worse. And after hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she had been saying to herself, "If I just touch his garments, I will get well." And immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that power from him had gone out, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd is pressing in on you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be cured of your disease." While he was still speaking, people came from the house of the synagogue official saying, "Your daughter has died. Why bother the teacher any further?" But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing. And after entering, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him. But putting them all outside, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was in bed. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astonished, and he gave them strict orders that no one was to know about this, and he told them to have something given her to eat. All right, so a lot there. So we see Jairus is a synagogue official. So some of these official, religious people at least did see Jesus for at least what he could do for them.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, "Look, my daughter's on the point of death. Can you come to my home and heal her?" And so Jesus is like, "Yeah, sure." They're walking that way. And we're seeing again, wherever Jesus went, people were always trying to be near him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a woman who was suffering bleeding for 12 years presses in amongst the people and touches his cloak. She's already confessed in her heart, like, if I do this, I know that I'll be healed. And Jesus knows it immediately and says, "Hey, who did this? Come forward." And so she then comes and confesses what happened. And this is a very humbling thing for her, and he declares her to be healed. So I think one of the things that really, we talked about before, we talked about some of the practicalities of some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
This woman really wasn't supposed to be there
Yeah.
because her issue of blood made her unclean based on Jewish law. Now, that's not to say that it made her less than or it made her a pariah or things like that. Mm-hmm. But when we look at the law that was given in the Old Testament, blood made things unclean, and so there had to be purification. You really, you're not supposed to be getting your blood all over the place, right?
Yeah.
And I know that sounds a little graphic, but like she really wasn't. But the point is, she really wasn't supposed to be there. But she's at a point of desperation.
Sure.
Yeah. So to have to confess what happened is to have to confess that she was essentially outside of what would be called the law.
Yeah.
By being there in the first place. And Jesus proclaims that she's healed and that it's her faith that has healed her.
Yeah.
Because she believed it has happened. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. You think about all those people that were touching Jesus. Mm-hmm. They weren't touching him. They were touching because they were in the way. They were bumping up against him. You walk through a crowded street, you're going to bump into people. But she was touching him for a reason. She had a prayer. She was, if I do this, this is. It sounds a little it sounds a little but
yeah.
But she had a faith that Jesus could heal her. And so that's why she touched her and touched him. Mm-hmm. And so it was Jesus saying is like, you're healed because I healed you, but it's because of your faith that I healed you.
Yeah.
And it is your faith that touching me did this. Not you bump up against me and you're immediately can lift 10 cars or whatever.
Right, yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. Well, no, it was she knew that this is all she needed to.
Yeah.
You kind of look at the two examples here. So Jairus is like, come to my house and lay hands on my daughter and be there and like do your thing.
Yeah.
And she's like, all I need is to touch the hem of the garment and I know that I'll be healed, right?
Yeah.
And that's what her faith level was. So you see these two different kind of faith levels.
Yeah.
And that's actually what happens next is we see, people come from Jairus' house and say, there's probably no point in troubling Jesus anymore. Your daughter has died. Mm-hmm. And Jesus says, do not be afraid, only believe. And he's kind of just he's almost like, look, it was her belief and her faith that allowed her to be healed. You need to just keep the faith at this point.
Yeah.
So he goes, he only brings Peter, James, and John with him, which is interesting. He brings a small group. And something else that's interesting is he keeps telling people that she's not dead.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a bunch of people out there weeping, and he says, hey, she's only sleeping. You don't need to cry about this. And their immediate response is to laugh at him,
Right.
right? And like, what a weird thing to do at a funeral.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
raises some questions about the authenticity of their grief, but you know, or maybe that's how they were expressing it, because they're like, "You're absurd if you think that we've mistaken that she's not dead."
Mm-hmm.
So he goes in. He only brings his people. He brings the girl's parents, and he tells her to get up, and she does. And then, you know, he does what any. He tells the parents to do what any good parent should do, and that's to feed her. You know, she's probably weak at this point, but now she can eat.
Mm-hmm.
Says, give her some food. And he told them that no one was to know about this. So again, we're seeing Jesus asking people to, hey, keep this on the DL, probably again for some logistical reasons, or again, to make sure that these revelations are incremental.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he only brings Peter, James, and John. And, you know, I think that, you know, there, and you see that in the Bible, you know, that Jesus was with disciples, but there were several times Peter, James, and John were like the closest. Those were the ones that he took up to the mountaintop that we'll talk about here in a few chapters. You know, other things like that. So those were his closest disciples. You could almost say, hey, those were his best friends. And, you know, I just quickly, I wasn't sure about this, so I just quickly went through. This is the first time that Mark records Jesus bringing back from the dead. You know, he's driven out spirits. He's healed leprosy. He's healed a paralyzed man. He's calmed winds, but now he's conquering death.
Yes.
You know, and so that's a new thing. And that's something completely that no one had ever seen, you know.
Right. It's very gosh, in the Old Testament even it's very rare. So we see it a little bit with like Elijah or Elisha. There's one where the boy had died and he basically lays hands on him and he comes back to life.
Yeah.
So we see that, and then is it the bones of Elisha? They throw a dead man onto the bones of Elisha, and he raises from the dead.
Yeah.
You know, so like it's understood that God has the power and ability to do this.
Yeah.
So this is a really big deal.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that's why he knew that this was such a big deal. Like, not just the general public, but even some of my disciples are going to be troubled by this. You know, let's just bring these three that get it.
Or maybe not even just troubled, but maybe overzealous by this.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Like, okay, this is it. Guys, this is the one we've been waiting for. Let's take the capital.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's kind of the understanding of who the Messiah is supposed to be, is this king who then is going to sit on this throne, but they are all looking at it in this natural sense.
Yeah.
Not in the spiritual sense. And that's why Jesus keeps talking about the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
And explaining it in a way that's different than just a throne in a palace in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So that wraps chapter 5. Any other thoughts on that?
You know, at the end, I just kind of thought of something. So the last verse, he says, he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. And, you know, I can kind of see why, because if people found out he could bring people back from the dead, you would think everybody would say, hey, my mother's been dead for 10 years. Can you bring her back alive? Can you do this? Can you do this? And you know, when we think about prayer, and we think about when we ask God for things, ask, seek, knock, we often have to remember, excuse me, we have to remember God is not a lottery system. You know, it's like, hey, I need this. Can you give me this? If I pray for this, if I pray for $1 million, God will give me $1 million. If I ask right, God will give me $1 million. If I ask this, He'll give me a big house. If I ask, He'll give me this. And you know, I can't help but wonder if some of the reason that He's keeping that things like that under wraps is because He wants people to follow Him, and He wants people to love Him and to know that He is the Messiah and that He is God.
Yeah.
And He doesn't want people coming just for this.
Right.
You know, hey, can you heal this? All right, see ya. You know, like he wants people to, he wants to preach to people. He wants to teach people. I mean, obviously, yes, he wants to heal people and obviously bring young children back from the dead and cast out demons and heal the blind and things like that. But he wants people coming to him for the right reason,
Yeah, and in the same sense,
And again, that's not like that's not written. That's kind of my own personal opinion. That's just an observation that I made.
It makes sense though, and it goes back to kind of what I was saying about like the natural, being a king in the natural versus being a king in the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
A lot of times I think we're guilty of looking at healing and deliverance as natural and like what's finite here on earth as opposed to what's infinite in God.
Yeah.
Right? Like I may never have this type of healing in my mortal life.
Yeah.
But in my eternal life, I have fullness of healing. I have fullness of everything in Christ, right? So just because you don't have this now, and like as you were saying that, you're like, all these people might start coming out of the woodwork. Can you do this? Can you do that? Can you do this? And when he doesn't, because that's not the will of God
right.
for that moment or for that time or for that person, then people get upset.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, well, why would you do it for him and not for me?
Yeah.
And there's always a reason.
Mm-hmm.
We just maybe don't understand it.
Yep.
And but I heard somebody say this the other day. Just because you can't think of a good reason doesn't mean there isn't one. Right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's chapter 5. So in the next chapter, in chapter 6, we'll get into Jesus teaching in his hometown, which should be fun. We look forward to seeing you there. Again, let us know in the comments what you think and what you're coming up with on your own, because you should be reading this on your own and studying it on your own as well. But thanks again for tuning in, and we hope you have a great day.